I found a very interesting quote that really relates that resonates with me, and it's around this whole idea of the transformation of silence. And I think that's very important because we're just finishing now the unit, the inclusive teaching unit, and we've had a group that's been very engaged, very motivated, and actually we created a safe space so the students there, the participants, the teachers could actually talk about their own experience but also relate it to what they were doing within creative areas, art and design, fashion, fine art, graphics, and but also talk about their own experience, thinking about how they could bring that in when they were looking at the work they were doing. And basically it's just the last paragraph, it's page 44 if people are going to get the book, but basically, and really she talks about that really, although that this is, to do this you have to move away from your fear, okay, that you have, we're afraid at times to speak, okay, and to change the silence. She says that it's not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. I think that's very powerful for me because I do think a lot of people have lived within silence for a very long time, with the number of microaggressions that's individuals may have had, which may be to do about their sexuality, might be to do about their race, might be to do with just sexism that they're experiencing on an ongoing basis at home. So, I mean, I think it's this sense of how it's really important to break that sense of the silence, but then to understand from doing that to seeing that as a model that you could actually, how do you do that in class, or how do you need to do that in a supportive way. So I agree. I think Audre Lorde is a teacher, is absolutely that, and what we're doing on the teaching course is basically to get teachers to feel, the confidence and feel that they can be the best teacher, which is providing a safe space, but also being aware that sometimes those spaces can be disruptive, they can be risk-taking, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but to actually feel that, you need to move away from the silence and you need to move into difference.
I think that's really important, and of course, when silence there is a metaphor, as much as it is actual silence, and it's about erasure of people's sense of contribution to knowledge production. Yeah. And I think Freire talks about that as well, the kind of in his book around silence and breaking the kind of cultures of silence. And in some senses, the other way to think about it is that pedagogy is really about not giving people a voice, because that assumes that they haven't got a voice, but enabling that voice to become manifest. And of course, people express that voice in different ways. And I think, as in Audrey's sense, she expresses herself through a poetic form. And, we tend to frown against poetry. It's not proper academic work or something. But actually, if you think about the ancient world, and in some cultures, if you think about, say, the Urdu language, it is a poetic language. Every sentence is in poetic form. And, it's only until kind of relatively recent times that we even, separated the idea of kind of poetic expression from some kind of objective scientific kind of language.
At one stage in the book, she does talk about poetry as well, in the sense that if you're looking at poetry, comparing it to prose, that poetry actually is something that poor people can do, because you don't need to have a typewriter necessarily. You can just have a pencil or a pen, or a pen, and a piece of paper, and you can do poetry. It can be short. So that could be for working class women, or but it's very powerful, and I think so that it shouldn't be seen as a dichotomy between poetry and prose. But again, I think poetry, going back to that, is about creativity, and we work in an art and design university where we are encouraging creativity, we're encouraging experimentation and risk taking. So really, she has a lot to say, I think.
And metaphors and similes are a very important aspect of the poetic form, and in some senses, if you look at even teaching and learning books, it says the best teachers are the ones that can mobilise metaphor and simile, because that can enable people to connect things that just don't seem to have any connection. So, I think she's got a lot to offer. Shall we look at some of the quotes then? I mean, shall I start with one?
Yes.
we're going to just take two quotes each. We could spend all day, actually. There's so much in there. The one that comes to mind to me was actually around the time I was looking at this book in the 80s, I was also involved in training and development. I was in the local authority, and we used to do a lot of what was called race training at the time. We used to get staff, particularly white staff, maybe from a privileged position, coming on these courses that were quite resentful that they were even had to come on the course to think about racism. But some of them would actually then feel very guilty. I'm responsible for slavery, or I'm responsible for 500 years of colonial. And Audrey, actually, there's a quote in her book about the emotion of guilt, which I use to reflect. And she says, guilt is not a response to anger. It's a response to one's own actions or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since there is then no longer guilt but a beginning of knowledge. Yet all too often, guilt is just another name for impotence, for defensiveness, destructive of communication. It becomes a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness. And I think that's really important, because I think what she says there, and this is what I experience in my work, is that those people would turn themselves into the victim, and that they would want some kind of pity, and in essence lose the focus that actually nobody is trying to victimize anybody, but trying to look at how the present has been produced from the past, yeah? And I used to think about, well, what would be a legitimate emotional response? I mean, Audrey's not saying that guilt isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's got to move to a process of accumulating new knowledge, yeah? Otherwise it becomes debilitating. And I think that shame is an interesting emotion. Maybe shame, for me, is a more empowering emotion, because when you feel a sense of shame, then you feel a sense that I've got to do something about this. And that could be self-knowledge, and it could be more. It could be getting involved in activism and reparations, call it what you want. And I think that's a much more powerful emotion that we should feel, because we feel a sense of responsibility, but also, to do something, as opposed to guilt being a kind of you get trapped in your own kind of powerlessness, in a sense.
Yeah. And defensiveness, and then you move into something else. So you move away, as opposed, because I think what she's talking about here is all about the communication act. It is about talking or discussing it. And yet the examples that you gave is that people start feeling very uncomfortable, this discomfort, this feeling that. So it is about it's a sort of like a close down on communication. So yes, I mean, but I do like what she says there about that. It's this sense of this ultimate protection for changelessness. So you've told me these things, so I feel bad about them. I'm in a position now where I don't know what to do with that, so therefore I'm going to do nothing. So I think it's important to have it there. I think it's important for people to understand that guilt, really, and sometimes that is a sense of guilt from a white person. That is a sense of guilt, not the sense of colonialism, sense of slavery, and all of that. But it's just about, as educators, we're educators. It's important when we are going to be working with students that are going to be doing new things, new designers, that they need to be thinking in different ways. So I think it's important that we challenge the participants that come onto this unit. We challenge them into thinking about this, and kind of thinking that, because what we are asking them to do is to start thinking about change, which goes back to Freire as well, which goes back to this sense of education being a practice of freedom and transformation. I
think that's a really good point, that pedagogy, effective pedagogy, should be about challenging, not about punishing. And the sense of guilt is then, or I'm guilty now, punish me. And it's not about punishment, is it? It's about inspiring people to take that new insight, if you like, and to be able to do something about it.